I'm currently directing a documentary. It's called Healing Hope, and it's about underground MDMA therapy. And so obviously the film had to touch on the history of the legality of psychedelics. It's often assumed that these substances were banned because they're really dangerous, but research has shown that they don't really seem to be. So that kind of leads to the question, why were they banned? The film doesn't go into current day politics because psychedelic therapies are being pushed both by conservative and progressive politicians, at least in the US. However, we did have to explain the political context of the 60s and 70s, which is what led to the war on drugs. Oh, and by we, I mean my sister and I. We wrote the movie together, and we also researched this video together. Also, I just want to preface this video by saying we are neither Republicans or Democrats, or not even American. We also have no skin in this game because we're not substance users, and we're also not part of any group that's going to be mentioned in this video. One theory is that the war on drugs was designed to target black communities, and you may have seen this quote floating around the internet. This is from John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic affairs advisor. Quote,
"You want to know what this was all really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
This is a very damning quote, and it was going to be a part of the movie in the first outline. That is, until we decided to actually fact-check it. And what we found while researching was so interesting that we felt we had to share it, and it also can give you a glimpse into the process of actually making a documentary like this. So this quote that Ehrlichman allegedly said in 1984 only appeared in 2016, when the reporter Dan Baum apparently found it while looking through his old notes from when he interviewed Ehrlichman for his book Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs and the Politics of Failure. And apparently he didn't use this extremely scathing admission in his book on this very topic because it didn't fit the narrative style. And also the quote was immediately contested by Ehrlichman's family, who said that this did not sound like their father and that he was not racist. And since both of them passed away in 1999 and 2020 respectively, we had no way to verify that Ehrlichman actually said this, so we couldn't include it in the documentary. But maybe if Dan Baum didn't use this quote in his book, he used other more damning admissions. And while looking for the book, we found another quote, this time from Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. In it he says,
"President Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to."
That's a really bad quote, and we do actually have a source for it. It's from Haldeman's diary. But how are we going to fact check this? It's Haldeman's diary. It's probably kept somewhere like in the US or something, and it's available for free on the internet. And we found the quote. He actually wrote this in his diary on April 28th, 1969. But there's one big problem with it. It's not about drugs. It was taken out of context. What he's actually talking about is welfare. Here's the full quote in context.
"Got into a deep discussion of welfare, trying to think out the family security decision, with Ehrlichman and me. President emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Problem with overall welfare plan is that it forces poor whites into the same position as blacks."
Yeah, I said that it was out of context, not that it was better in context. And it actually gets worse.
"Feels we have to get rid of the veil of hypocrisy and guilt and face reality. Pointed out that there has never in history been an adequate black nation, and they are the only race of which this is true. Says Africa is hopeless, and the worst there is Liberia, which we built."
That's extremely racist and a crazy thing to write in your diary, but it doesn't really tell us that the war on drugs was designed to target black communities. But if he wrote stuff like this about welfare, what did he write about drugs? We have a primary source from the time, from inside the administration, and who apparently speaks very candidly. So if anything is going to tell us about the underlying motivations behind the war on drugs, it's probably in here. So join us as we fall down the rabbit hole of the Haldeman Diaries.
Paul, how often have you taken LSD?
About 4 times.
America's public enemy number one is drug abuse.
LSD.
LSD is not used in fast. People are seriously disturbed.
Said it is a danger that will not pass with the passing of the war in Vietnam. It is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
It's Tutti Frutti ice cream.
He is the man who says no for the President of the United States, a mission he executes with a singleness of purpose and an authority that are respected and feared throughout official Washington. Bob Haldeman is probably the most powerful man in the country next to the President, and he got that way because he spends more time next to the President than anybody else in government.
Haldeman initially started his career in advertisement. Then he met Richard Nixon in 1956 and followed him through a series of failed election campaigns all the way to his presidential victory in 1968. He was already friends with John Ehrlichman, so he was the one who brought him into the administration. And together they formed a team that had quite the reputation. Their leadership style was based on being tough and mechanically efficient, and combine that with their German last names, and you get nicknames such as the Berlin Wall, the Prussians, the Dobermans, the German Shepherds, and even the Nazis. Haldeman was obsessed with recording everything. He kept a diary for nearly every single day he worked in the administration, so that's from January 1969 to April 1973. He also filmed a lot using his Super 8 camera, which is the footage you're seeing now on screen. He came into the White House at the cusp of the 70s. Anti-war protests were raging after 15 years in Vietnam, while a growing number of movements advocated for peace and social changes. It was a time of second-wave feminism, of the fight for reproductive rights, the Stonewall riots and pushes in civil rights movements. It was a time of counterculture, of rebelling against the dominant models of consumerism and conservative family norms. The largest counterculture movement were the hippies. And psychedelics, especially LSD, were an integral part of hippie culture. They viewed the substance as a way of expanding their consciousness and questioning the status quo. Their use of it aligned with their rejection of mainstream values as a means of connecting back to nature and spirituality. Before Nixon was even elected, recreational use of LSD exploded in popularity, which led to a huge moral panic exacerbated by the media. Outlets at the time ran stories about bad trips causing psychotic reactions. They said LSD would scramble your chromosomes and that you were gonna die jumping off a window if you took it. Then, reports about soldiers in Vietnam using heroin also alarmed the public at home, who thought that thousands of veterans would come as a wave of drug addicts, that they would swarm healthcare services and cause a surge in criminality. So, one thing we expected to find in the diaries was the same worry from the administration about a health and addiction crisis.
However, we didn't really see that in the diaries. Out of 1,500 days, drugs are only mentioned on 44 of them, and mostly in passing. On the day the Controlled Substances Act is passed, it's literally just mentioned as, "we signed a bill." So you don't really get the sense that they were particularly worried about drugs. And that's not because they don't talk about their issues. There's several things that come up over and over again, like their PR, desegregation, foreign policy, etc. Seeing the media narrative of the time, we expected to find a lot more mentions of just how widespread drug use had become. But there's not much about them. However, when they do appear, they're framed in a very specific way, as a political tool. The first time they're mentioned is on October 23rd, 1969, when Art Linkletter came to give a speech about narcotics in which she blamed his daughter's suicide on LSD. It's important to note that no drugs were actually ever found in her system.
Started with another of our schools for congressmen, this time on narcotics. Had Art Linkletter come in to make part of the presentation. Ehrlichman said it was very successful. Democratic leaders outdid themselves in jumping on the bandwagon. President extremely impressed and is now much more up on the whole problem, and fully determined to charge ahead and get something done. That is proving to be a very valuable fringe benefit of these sessions. President now wants education funds tripled, huge attack on media for going along, exploration of all ways to stop traffic, tie in dope with organized crime, etc.
And the very next day, Haldeman says this.
Still pushing hard on narcotics follow-up. Yesterday's meeting made a strong impression. Has a steady flow of ideas on how to capitalize.
The word capitalize reveals a recurring theme in the diaries, which is that they were constantly looking for issues to rally people behind to get votes and have Nixon re-elected. Yeah, big surprise, politicians just care about being elected. The American system in particular, with 4-year terms with midterms in between, leads presidents to basically be campaigning all the time. By 1971, drugs, which are often lumped in with a general crime issue, start to appear as a, quote, opportunity to display, quote, positive leadership. The reason why there's such a good opportunity is because people are worried about them. In July 1971, Haldeman and the rest of the administration dissect a Roper poll that showed that for 47% of Americans, drugs were the biggest problem in the country. The same poll said that a third of Americans felt that there was a lack of strong leadership, and the administration takes this poll very seriously, and they start angling their policies accordingly. According to Politico, just 3 years earlier, before Nixon took office, only 3% of Americans viewed drugs as the country's #1 problem. This shows the effect that the media and Nixon's crusade had on public opinion. And interestingly, a month before the Roper poll, Haldeman says this.
He commented that revenue sharing only matters if it's tied to tax reduction, welfare reform only if it relates to getting people off of welfare. He emphasized that we shouldn't be concerned if it's something we'll actually accomplish, and pointed out that JFK was doing all of his progress building on phony issues. But rather we should look in terms of how we create issues. We need an enemy, we need controversy, we need to do something that will build those things. Drugs and law enforcement may be one, especially since we're so weak in our standing in the polls on those.
Yeah, so after a while he started doing audio entries, so what you heard was his voice. This could confirm the idea that the outrage was manufactured by the administration. For them, it was a phony issue. They needed an enemy to rally people against. By creating a boogeyman and waging a crusade against it, Nixon could appear as a savior, and drugs appear to be a convenient tool for that. In the diary, drugs are never mentioned alongside healthcare, and addiction is literally just never talked about. Again, in this quote, drugs are mentioned alongside law enforcement, and after the Controlled Substances Act is passed, drugs are never framed as a public health issue, but as a crime one. Previously, Haldeman repeats several times in his diary that they wanted Nixon to have a domestic image as a strong, tough crime fighter, and didn't want to be a, quote, goody-goody. They literally talk about angling their policies in favor of repression and discipline and not compassion. But let's circle back to the Roper poll. The entry where they discuss it is a very in-depth meeting where they talk about every issue highlighted by the poll, both domestically and internationally. Interestingly, when talking about how to frame the issue of drugs, this is what Nixon said.
At this point, the president made the comment that, quote, "It repels me to demagogue things, except in major areas," close quote, which practically broke Connolly up, although the president didn't notice it.
We can't know exactly what he implied by demagoguing, but it reinforces the idea that they viewed drug use as something that the public cared about, but that they didn't seem to be particularly worried about themselves. While they may not seem to be particularly worried about substance use itself, the diary shows that the Nixon administration viewed it as a wider symptom, a canary in the coal mine for moral decay and a crisis of meaning amongst the youth. As the Vietnam War was coming to an end, and as material conditions kept improving, the general public didn't have any great challenges to form a purpose against. So they anticipated this existential boredom as a looming threat to the morale of the country.
The president then got into some comment on his reaction to the Roper poll, making the point that even with all we have now, physically and materially, people are depressed regarding the future. The end of the war will remove one of the depressants. We've got to work on drugs, but we must recognize that when they name that so high on the list, it may just be an excuse.
It seems that the excuse could be for this lack of purpose they identified. A few weeks later, they talk about a shift towards religion in the college-aged youth, which they saw as indicative of a need for answers that they were looking for in drugs. So it's not a health issue, and it's not even really just a crime one. It's a deeper philosophical one. So they weren't just doing evil schemes in smoky backrooms. From their POV, they were trying to govern in a way that would address people's problems. And for them, the rise of drug use was a warning sign of the direction America was heading towards. Nixon positioned himself as a staunch conservative, and just in general, his administration, and Haldeman in particular, had a reputation for being very devout and straight edge. So it was probably not just a calculated use of an issue, they were just morally opposed to drugs personally, and saw them as a manifestation of a wider culture war that was spreading across the West and as a sign of the moral decay of America.
Drugs are often mentioned alongside other cultural things that the administration viewed as degenerate. They were also strongly against pornography, obscenities, bad kids, but these are all things you can't legislate against as much. It's a little funny how Nixon campaigned against bad words, seeing how vulgar he was in private, as revealed by his White House tapes. Nixon was also famously paranoid, so he gets a bit conspiratorial about the origins of this immorality plaguing the country, and he told Haldeman he believed drugs were a foreign weapon to subvert America, alongside homosexuality. The context for this quote is that the TV show All in the Family was airing at the time, a show that broke ground on a lot of social issues, including the fact that it had gay characters and storyline about gay characters, which followed the fact that in 1969, during Nixon's first year in office, the Stonewall riots had kicked off the gay liberation movement. There's a tape of the conversation from the previous quote, and in it, we get details about Nixon's opinion.
The point that I make is that, goddamn, I do not think that you glorify on public television homosexuality. You ever see what happened? You know what happened to the Greeks? Homosexuality destroyed. Sure, Aristotle was a homo. We all know that. But with Socrates,
He never had the influence of television.
the last 6 Roman emperors. You see, homosexuality, immorality generally, these are the enemies of strong societies. That's why the communists, the left-wingers, are pushing each other. They're trying to destroy us.
This type of argument is still used today, despite the fact that it's very poor knowledge of history to attribute the fall of the Roman Empire to homosexuality and degeneracy. In general, the Nixon administration wanted to crack down on what they called permissiveness, which included drugs, but also student protests. Young people viewed the administration as reactionary and were loud about their disapproval. In 1971, strong public pressure passed the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age to 18, making young people a rising political group. That's an extra 14 million voters. That's more people at once than the population of Pennsylvania. By that point, Nixon had already identified them as not part of his base. Young people, not Pennsylvania. As early as the diary entries of 1969, they have given up on getting them on his side. And with Nixon's personality, if you're not on his side, you are his enemy. It was revealed during the Watergate investigation that Nixon kept an actual list of his enemies, which is what reasonable people do. But it's still shocking to use such extreme language against entire groups of people you're governing, to view them as enemies to destroy.
Back to the big issue. Softness on students. Wants a tough statement, an outlandish bill if necessary to get attention. Anxious to build quote record regarding the left-type issues, Cambodia, students, dope, repression, moratorium, etc., and hang the opponents.
This kind of violent martial language leads to violent martial action when that is the framing through which you view the world and the people around you. On May 1st, 1970, students at Kent State University organized a protest against the invasion of Cambodia that Nixon had launched the day before, effectively escalating a war that he had promised to end if he got elected. After several days of protests and a ban from the school, on May 4th, 2,000 people still gathered on campus, and the National Guard began dispersing the crowd, first with tear gas and then with bullets. In 13 seconds, they fired up to 67 rounds against unarmed students. 4 were killed, 8 wounded, and 1 paralyzed for life. Outrage erupted. That week, Nixon had come under fire in the press for calling the protesters bums, and many fingers pointed towards him after the shooting, including Life magazine, titling an issue "The Crisis of Presidential Leadership." In the diaries, Haldeman points out the tough reaction from the public, but by May 6th, Nixon's focus is on retaliation.
Reviewed overall strategy. President realizes he's up against a real tough one. Kissinger wants to let the students go for a couple of weeks, then move in and club at them. Ehrlichman wants to communicate, especially symbolically. All agreed to the plan, but Kissinger very concerned that we not appear to give in any way. Thinks President can really club at them if we just wait for Cambodian success. I disagree, because then there'll be a new excuse.
When the guardsmen who killed the Kent State students were eventually acquitted, Nixon went as far as to try and find ways to turn the issue against the opposition. At the time of Kent State, their only tool to hit back was wiretapping the dissidents. But with the rise of drugs as a perceived issue, which they already associated with young people, they found a new weapon. The Controlled Substances Act, which scheduled and criminalized substances that were popular among hippies. Hi, quick addendum to clarify something that appeared a lot in articles, in part because it's also in the alleged Ehrlichman quote from the beginning, the idea that Nixon specifically criminalized heroin and cannabis to target black communities. Nixon actually had nothing to do with banning them. They'd been made illegal long before the Controlled Substances Act. Now, were there racist motivations behind the original ban of those drugs? That's a lot harder to say for sure. There's a lot of information circulating. Not all of it is verified. Here's what I could more or less confirm. Officially, it seems to have been banned because of an association with crime from the 19th century to the 1920s. And with the 1920s rise in crime, it seems to have been a fear. While heroin was associated with the jazz and blues scene, which was predominantly black, it seems true that this association had its peak later in the 50s with high-profile fatal overdoses. However, in the 19th and early 20th century, the moral panic that erupted around opium seems to have mainly targeted Chinese immigrants and the quote-unquote crime dens of Chinatown. Apparently, there were police persecutions and rampant xenophobia even in PSAs. Also, from propaganda films, however reliable those are, it seems that people thought heroin infested Italian, Irish, Hispanic neighborhoods, tying immigrant communities to crime. Still a thing. However, that doesn't mean we can attribute the opium ban solely to xenophobia. It seems to have been a wide moral panic. For cannabis, there is a common belief that marijuana was outlawed specifically to persecute Mexican immigrants during the Great Depression. However, the facts that we can verify are not as straight. 1, yes, apparently the public associated cannabis with Mexicans, but not only. 2, Mexico banned cannabis almost 20 years before the US did, and their crackdown was intense, with similar arguments to the American crackdown. 3, however, according to this NPR article at least, it seems true that a switch did occur between using mostly the term cannabis to mostly using marijuana in the decades before the drug was banned. It wasn't intentional or aimed to demonize Spanish-speaking immigrants. However, there's no definitive way to say. It could also be due to the fact that it was mostly publicized through the initial anti-marijuana crackdown from Mexico, and so they kind of, the American press, took the term from the Mexican press. That's also possible. Lastly, from the looks of it, the most likely answer, again, is general moral panic. The press, both in Mexico and in the US, seems to have depicted cannabis as the drug of madness, so people were terrified. So while xenophobia did play into the discourse surrounding the ban, there is nothing that tells us for sure that it was the cause of it. So back to what I was saying, the Controlled Substances Act was signed on October 27, 1970, and went into effect on May 1st, 1971. On that same day, tens of thousands of people gathered in Washington to protest against the Vietnam War. And this is what Haldeman says in his diary.
He is concerned, though, that we go hard on this. Fortunately, that's exactly what they developed in Washington, and Ehrlichman called me later in the day to say that their plan now is to bust the demonstrators Sunday morning and probably move in with narcotics agents to arrest as many as they can. This, they think, will bust up their plans and make it hard for them to do their traffic stopping exercise on Monday.
And then on May 2nd,
he got some reports from Ehrlichman during the day. Plans seemed to be satisfied that they were set up. John said they moved in hard and fast, arrested a lot of them, and that most of the rest were packing and going home, and he thought they had really broken it up pretty well. The president was somewhat concerned that maybe we had moved too hard on the thing, and that it was a close call as to whether we should have done this or forced them to go ahead with their plans. I think we came out right.
Over 12,000 people were arrested. That's the largest mass arrest in US history, and it was facilitated by the weaponizing of drug enforcement. This was a massive scandal. The arrest was seen as unconstitutional, and Nixon was accused of trying to create a repressive police state. The government ended up being convicted for it by the federal court. Here, Haldeman fully admits that they were willing to use drug legislation as a means of population control, which could confirm part of Ehrlichman's unverified quote. But what about racism?
Well, when Haldeman talks about the administration's enemies, he conveniently gives us a very precise list.
We can't win over our enemies. Youth, black, Jew.
And again, their enemies is referring to people they felt they couldn't get votes from. And while we could extrapolate that rebels could include civil rights activists, there was never a direct association in the diaries between black people and drugs. However, were they racist, and did that impact their policies? Well, remember the really bad welfare quote from earlier? That kind of answers the question. They were definitely drafting up legislation that directly targeted black people. And while you may have heard of Nixon's racism, it was not a known fact at the time, since before the Watergate tapes came out, Nixon had shown support for civil rights, and even had personal correspondence with Martin Luther King, until he refused to comment when MLK got arrested in 1960, which cost him the black vote in favor of Kennedy. However, in the diaries we get a clear look at what he thought behind the scenes. One of the most salient issues in the diaries is school desegregation, in particular busing. While school segregation had officially ended in 1954, most schools were still de facto segregated, and a proposed solution to that was busing, which meant taking students from one district to another district using buses in an effort to integrate them. Busing comes back over and over and over in the diaries, especially in 1970, when it was a hot-button issue in the media, and Nixon was vehemently against it.
Wants Ehrlichman to move fast on developing a constitutional amendment regarding schools. Feels we should bite the bullet now and hard. If it's called racism, so be it. Feels we have to take a black or white position. Didn't even notice the pun. Can't be on both sides because we just get hit from both and please no one.
But since it was a Supreme Court decision, Nixon didn't have a say in the matter. But Haldeman does explain that they were going to try to enforce it in the narrowest way possible, and capitalize on the outrage to run candidates on anti-integration rhetoric. Yeah, the playbook hasn't changed. From the diaries, we understand that Nixon mostly gives up on the black vote as early as 1969. Instead, he chose to focus on creating a base consisting of Southern Republicans, blue-collar Catholics, and ethnics, which, if like me you didn't know what that was, meant any non-German/Anglo-Saxon Protestant white people, so Italians, Irish, Poles, etc. And if you pause to read these quotes, you may also notice that he talked a lot about Jews, but just hold on, one thing at a time. Pandering and choosing a base are a normal part of politics. What's shocking is to see how hateful the language used gets, just as it's shocking to have an example of structural racism laid out so explicitly.
The only domestic questions were on meeting with the black congressman, where the president said he hoped it would be worked out, on the integrated housing question, where he said he'd have a recommendation on the blackjack issue in 30 days, and that then he tried to explain the difference between human rights and economic integration, making the point that we will enforce the law requiring that any human has the right to buy or rent a house where he wants to if he's able to do it. But we will not use economic force to bring about racial or economic balance within a neighborhood or to upset the zoning planning for an area.
But don't worry, it actually gets a lot worse. First off, when reading the diaries, you sense a general disdain for black people and civil rights activists. Here's a few examples.
Pretty fed up with blacks and their hopeless attitude. Long afternoon meeting with black publishers. President very patient about it. Guess they really harangued him, but he knows he has to go through it occasionally. Then a batch of appointments in the afternoon, topped by greeting the Institute of Black Elected Officials in the Rose Garden. Another of the duty type deals. President felt, though, that 45 minutes of just shaking hands was better than having to prepare even a 10-minute speech. Had Harriet Ellen, Chapin's secretary, come over to talk about problems and viewpoints of a responsible, intelligent President very impressed with column posed by William Raspberry, in parentheses, black, regarding school problem, an idea that forced integration won't work. Had meeting with Raspberry, black columnist, regarding his thoughts on the school problem. President feels he'll destroy himself by trying to be goody-goody. Has to be strong, tough crime fighter. Then disturbed to find he had meeting with black insurance company men. But they're good guys, so he did it. Then President met with group of black doctors, in parentheses, much to his chagrin at having another black group, never any other kind, and the Desegregation Advisory Committee from North Carolina. Raised some schedule points, and with Alex in there, that he doesn't want any more blacks, Jews, or DC government people. Wants Balzano and Rogers kept in the White House with the Director of Information Office. Also the black.
And somehow it gets even worse. Imagine this. It's dinner time on the presidential yacht, the USS Sequoia. Nixon, Haldeman, and their guests are enjoying drinks, and they are talking about what they're planning for the 100th anniversary of baseball. And then, without any further context, Nixon, and I quote,
went through his whole thesis regarding blacks and their genetic inferiority and the hopelessness of any early change in the situation. Have to wait for inbreeding. In the meantime, just take care of them and help the few good ones to rise up.
And Haldeman added,
I firmly believe he's right.
I have read this quote dozens of times now, and it's shocking every single time. Not only does it show that Nixon and Haldeman, because he agreed, were personally racist, and that's not some wild accusation, this is the definition of racism, but it also shows that they actually approach their policymaking through this lens. And mind you, this is before Nixon referred to black people as his enemies in the diaries. Also, we know that he shared his thesis with basically everyone on different occasions because we have several sources for the same quote. Also, 2 days later, this is what Haldeman writes in his diary.
President discovered, buried in the Kissinger briefing paper, that he had apparently agreed to a visit from President of Gabon. Very upset, said would have to cancel. He'll only do Selassie and Mobutu this year, not Bongo. He deeply resents the proliferation of African nations and hates to give them any more recognition than he has to. Has decided to limit total number of state visits to 10 per year. Still quite a few. This
quote calls back to the welfare quote, and even with the historical context of the time where many African countries were aligning themselves with the Soviet Union, the fact that he uses words like deeply resents and hate shows that it's not just geopolitical strategy or time management to only have 10 African visits per year. But back to Nixon's thesis. It actually comes back a few years later when an article is published in the Atlantic that actually aligns with his beliefs. Haldeman then witnesses a conversation that Nixon had with Daniel Moynihan, his Secretary of Urban Affairs. Moynihan was also the author of a controversial report on black poverty.
The president called Moynihan on the phone during the day to talk with him about the Herrnstein article from Atlantic Monthly that Moynihan had sent in to him. It discusses IQ and racial relationships. And the president made the point that it was important for him to know these things and then do everything possible to deny them. That is the genetic racial problem. And he commented on Muskie's point that he was right if you look cynically at the polls that a black would hurt, but no leader must say that or say it regarding a Jew or a Catholic or anyone else, or else you'll encourage latent prejudice. It's clear that not everybody is equal, but we must ensure that anybody might go to the top.
There's an actual recording of this phone call from the White House tapes, and it's really weird to hear Nixon say stuff that could be said by neo-Nazis online today.
And incidentally, it was a rather neat trick to point out that the Asians are number one and the Caucasians are number two.
And the
Eskimos are above the whites, which is good. Everybody says, well, God, you can't award the work requirements only for the purpose of making these poor colored women, who can't work and with little babies coming every month, or it's every 9 months, I believe. Anyway, I have mixed feelings. I receive their ambassadors. They change all the time, and I've had I love them. They're so kind and so nice. And they're children.
Yeah.
Children.
Yeah.
Huh?
And they always want something like children.
Oh, God, yes, they want. Well, what can you do? I know, but what I meant is it's so childlike, the childlike faith and this and that. And, of course, a lot of them are crooks, but we have crooks, too. But there are many other areas, as you've well pointed out, where they can beat the hell out of us. Now, and they should be proud of those. Athletics isn't a bad achievement. You look at the World Series, for God's sakes, and what would either of these teams done without, what would Pittsburgh be without hell of a lot of blacks, huh?
Sure.
And music, the dance. But on the other hand, when you get to some of the more, shall we say, some of the more profound, rigid disciplines, basically, they have a hell of a time making it. But in terms of good lawyers, even though a lot of them go to law schools, it is not really their dish of tea. See?
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying that blacks cannot govern. I am saying they have a hell of a time. Now that must demonstrate something.
The link between race and IQ is beyond the scope of this video, but I just wanted to quickly address it because it's still rampant on the internet today. It's bullshit. The points made in the article have been debunked. If you want to learn more, here's a brief explanation on screen, and you can also watch the Veritasium video about it. But finish this one first. Just know that when you hear the article, Nixon, and people today using scientific jargon like genetic and biological in the context of social inequality, they're masking prejudice as rationality. But the fact that Nixon says, in the meantime, just take care of them and help the few good ones to rise up, and it's clear that not everybody is equal, but we must ensure that anybody might go to the top, shows that they didn't see themselves as being hateful, but as pragmatic and realistic. They believed in a scientifically backed hierarchy between ethnicities, which meant that for them, policies for social inequality were useless because inequality was baked into DNA. And while it doesn't give us more information about the war on drugs, it confirms that they were treating people differently based on skin color. And again, Nixon's mind was Manichaean. You're either with him or against him. And the diary shows that they were ideologically blinded. This was exemplified when the inmates of the Attica prison rioted, demanding more humane living conditions and accusing the guards of discriminatory treatment. They took 42 staff members hostage and negotiated with the authorities, who refused to give them amnesty for revolting. Governor Rockefeller, with Nixon's approval, decided to use force. State troopers stormed the prison, a decision that would have devastating consequences. It was a massacre. 33 inmates were killed, and 10 of the guards that they had taken hostage, almost all shot by law enforcement, some using ammunition that was banned by the Geneva Convention. It was a huge scandal infused with fake news to vilify the inmates, and this is what Haldeman writes in his diary.
He then called Governor Rockefeller to tell him he backed him to the hilt on his move on busting up the prison strike in Attica, New York. He assured him he was right not to grant amnesty and that the president was behind him all the way. It turns out there were 7 guard hostages killed and 32 prisoners, all black. The president made the point again to Rockefeller that we can't tolerate this kind of anarchy and that he was solidly behind him in his move on it.
This is a result of considering your political opponents as enemies. You stop seeing them as people you govern and gives you a justification for violence, which is devastating when you have the nation's arsenal at your disposal. So while there's no direct linking of black people to drugs in the diary, we can clearly see that Nixon and his officials were personally racist and that they were drafting up legislation to target black people. But again, no explicit mention of using drug enforcement to target minorities. However, and you saw this coming, there's another group of people Nixon tied to drugs.
If you take a paranoid personality like Nixon's and you combine it with his personal prejudice, you get a recipe for conspiratorial thinking. This is where we get the last of his triad of enemies, Jews. Nixon's anti-Semitism is rampant throughout the diaries. Like black and young people, they're a group that he despises, but tries to get the votes of, then gives up again and again and resents them for their lack of support. It needs to be said that all of these communities are not monolithic voting groups. They span across the political board, but reading the diaries, you don't get the sense that Nixon thought of it that way. There's also a heavy disdain for them, like for his other categories of enemies. But there's a different, not very subtle undercurrent. Here's a few quotes so you get the idea.
Decided to expand Goldamer dinner and make some hay with Jewish community and congressmen who need Jewish support. Rose's idea. Really mad at the Jews because of Pompidou reaction. And is saying so pretty loudly.
This is in the context of protests against France selling warplanes to Libya.
Had a lot of thoughts about the volunteer board last night. As would be expected from Max Fisher, it is heavily Jewish and Michigan-oriented.
Sunday, March 7th, the president came back from Camp David for White House Church. He called me just before church, a little disturbed to discover that we were having a rabbi again. He made the point that there are only 5 million Jews out of 200 million people, so one rabbi service in the first term would have been enough. We shouldn't have had a second one. And he certainly doesn't want any more this term. And he made the point again that we have to forget about the Jews as far as the domestic thing is concerned, that they're against the president in any event. He expects him to play it politically, that we can't have the American Jews bitching regarding the plane deliveries, and we can't push Israel too hard and have a confrontation. So he's to keep Cisco slowed down. He's to say he's doing the plain paragraph, or I'm to say that he's put the plain paragraph in the memo for the record so that he can tell his Jewish friends that that's been ordered. We must not let this issue hurt us politically. The president won't discuss it. Connolly recommends we crank up Milt Friedman on the international economic thing because Arthur Burns is cutting us up with the Jewish columnists. The key is whether the bedrock is hard, and in our case it certainly appears to be, but we will lose some off the soft fringes. and that will cause some slippage. He says it'll be with youth, because as they get back to college and get under pressure, they'll start fading away. With Jews, where we should have no expectation of doing better than 30%, and with blacks, where we'll only get 10% at best, because there is a race issue, and we're on the wrong side of it as far as the blacks are concerned. Made the crack in reviewing the press list of whether there were any non-Jews going in the press corps to China.
Cool it with the anti-Semitic remarks.
This is more than resentment towards people who did not vote for him. There's an accusation in here that falls in line with the worst of anti-Semitic rhetoric. Nixon fully subscribed to the idea that Jewish people control the media. He was famous for his antagonism towards the press, even going as far as trying to ban certain press outlets from White House events. But when he talks about the press, there's an implication here that we need to understand. Early in the re-election year, Nixon was getting bad press coverage, and he took advice from Billy Graham, who was a famous televangelist at the time.
There was considerable discussion of the terrible problem arising from the total Jewish domination of the media, and agreement that this was something that would have to be dealt with. Graham has the strong feeling that the Bible says that there are satanic Jews, and that that's where our problem arises.
If you're sound of mind in any way, this satanic Jews thing will sound batshit crazy to you, but believe it or not, it does show up to this day on some back corners of the internet. It goes without saying that this type of conspiracy comes from people who are too far gone in deranged thinking and has no basis in reality or history whatsoever. Again, if you're interested in a deeper explanation, pause to read on screen. Also, while researching, we found the White House tape of this conversation. And it gets even worse.
They're smart, and they are energized, in my judgment, by a supernatural power.
Well, also they do something else, but they're not only smart, they stick together.
And you see, of course Hitler didn't, they had a stranglehold on Germany, on the banking of Germany, on everything in Germany. And the media, they had the whole thing, you see. But he went about it wrong. But this stranglehold has got to be broken, or this country is going to go down the drain.
You believe that?
Yes, sir.
I can't ever say it, but I believe it.
But it does not end here. There's several times in the diaries when they discuss Jewish support in political fundraising and not wanting to accept, quote, Jewish money because they were scared of, quote, potential influence. There's also recordings of Nixon saying that Jews are all over the government and that he wanted them out of DC. This is corroborated in the diaries when he gets re-elected and has to appoint administration officials. He says he wants no Jewish members of his cabinet except Stein and Kissinger. There's two common defenses to deny Nixon's anti-Semitism. The first one is that one of his closest aides, Henry Kissinger, was Jewish. The second one is that he was a major ally of Israel. But again, the diaries give us a look behind the scenes here as well. Kissinger was National Security Advisor. He had one of the most central roles in the administration and the history of that time. From what Haldeman writes, there were tensions surrounding him, and they thought that his Jewish identity made him unfit to decide on foreign policy in the Middle East. Also, on the topic of Nixon's support of Israel, the diaries show us that privately they had a tense relationship and accused them of wanting to exert influence on the US. Haldeman also explains that their support of Israel was mostly motivated by Cold War strategy. They just didn't want the Soviets to have access to the Mediterranean. But what does any of this have to do with the war on drugs? Well, in 1971, when Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, there was already pushback against how punitive the measures were. In particular, from Bertram Brown, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, who argued that cannabis was not dangerous enough to warrant such harsh penalties and advocated for its decriminalization. Nixon accused them of being disloyal and wanted to have him fired. A few days later, Nixon was supposed to attend a conference where Dr. Brown would be present, but he refused to share the stage with him and left. Dr. Brown was Jewish, and this is what Haldeman says the same day.
He made the point earlier this morning that he wants to put out a statement on marijuana that's really strong, as he said, one that tears the ass out of them. He also commented on the question of why all the Jews seem to be the ones that are for liberalizing the regulations on marijuana.
We can't be sure what his points were exactly, so we can't go into conjecture, but when you know that Nixon already thought that drugs were being pushed by external influences to destroy America and that he had a lot of conspiracy theories regarding Jews, You could take a few guesses, but we can't extrapolate like that. But what we do know is that time and time again, it always goes back to winning and losing votes. In August 72, during the last months of Nixon's re-election campaign, the Soviet Union instated a diploma tax on Jews that wanted to leave the USSR. The sums were exorbitant and could amount to years of salary, which caused an uproar in the West. Despite public pressure, Nixon and Kissinger were reluctant to act against it, because it would put in jeopardy the SALT agreements with the USSR, which aimed to limit the proliferation of nuclear ICBMs. However, they also thought that not doing anything might lose them votes in the election.
Thinks we're still all on the positive side on the Jewish question. No problems regarding the Soviet Jews. Expects to win Florida 70%.
This way of seeing issues through a lens of calculation rather than ethics highlights a larger trend in Nixon's politics that can help us understand the motivations for the war on drugs. And there's a term for people who would use any means in order to achieve their ends.
Again, unsurprisingly, the goal of any politician is to get votes, and that's clearly laid out in the diaries, but it's astonishing to see the lengths that they would go to and the machinations that were going on behind the scenes. For example, posturing about social issues even though they didn't believe in them, not actually doing anything about the environment because it was not a concern for their base, and then actively trying to dismantle environmental regulations after DDT was banned, not doing anything about the state of prisons, despite calling them a horrible disgrace because there was, quote, no political value in it, doing damage control on the My Lai massacre so that public opinion wouldn't turn against the war, strategically delaying issues that didn't pertain to their voter base, timing a freeze on food prices right before the election, knowing that it wouldn't work and people wouldn't notice until after they had voted, delaying the withdrawal from Vietnam until after it couldn't affect the election. They also floated nuking Korea because they thought it would get them support at home, but cooler heads prevailed and Kissinger was pissed. Along those lines, there's also a declassified segment where Nixon says in the context of the India-Pakistan conflict that, quote, the Indians need a mass famine. They also just talk openly about following Machiavellian theory, and they say things like no intelligent people would question the reasoning behind the Christmas bombings of Vietnam, which was to force the North Vietnamese to negotiate. And on the topic of drugs, despite having just banned them, a declassified segment from June 1971 tells us that they wanted to maintain drug production and traffic in Thailand in order to not destabilize the economy. This could be due to the fact that Thailand was surrounded by countries that were either communist or facing communist insurgencies. Thailand was also facing a communist insurgency on its own territory. It could also be due to the fact that the pharmaceutical industry needs opium to produce painkillers like morphine and codeine. Hi, this is post-production Ilya. So we checked, and according to the DEA, legal opium cultivation is only allowed in Australia, India, and Turkey for the pharmaceutical industry. Opium was already illegal in Thailand and had been since 1959. However, it seems like the CIA, maybe allegedly trafficked opium in Laos to fight against its communist insurgency. So maybe they did that in Thailand. Actually, never mind, we found sources claiming that the CIA was doing the exact same thing in Thailand, Vietnam, Burma, and China as well. The CIA obviously denies these allegations. But it's unclear whether they actually did it because Haldeman in the quote is quoting someone else suggesting that. And it's also, I think, unlikely that the pharmaceutical industry would buy black market opium when it's like really regulated. And just in general, there's like weird classified stuff in the diary, like even jokes and like personal drama. So don't know what to make of this one. When reading the diaries, it was shocking to see these things being said in such an open and nonchalant way. But what's wilder is that they felt completely justified in doing these things because they thought they were facing a concerted attempt from people who hated the country, which justified using any means necessary to protect it. And again, they thought that they were at a crossroads in history where they needed to find a new purpose to America, and they were willing to, quote, demagogue it. Here's another quote that gets us into their POV.
He then got into his general philosophic discussion, said the problem is that we're good managers and we do things because they're right. So we appear to be cold and efficient, and people measure compassion by passion for spending, and we don't have it. So we have to do like Bobby Kennedy, say you care about the poor folks, say we want to do these things. As a sub-theme to making our substantive case, we've got to make the case for the compassionate approach. The question is not cutting, it's a question of how much we increase. Symbolism is the area where we're weak. You can't get it across because we're not comfortable as demagogues.
This quote shows that there was a gap between how they viewed themselves and how they actually acted. Just a few years earlier, they talked about saying they cared about issues without actually doing anything about them. And also the idea of waging a war on drugs is inherently symbolic. Here's another quote I found interesting on this topic. This is after Nixon told Haldeman and Ehrlichman to resign to take the fall for Watergate.
The president called this morning from Key Biscayne, said, I didn't want this Easter to go by without reminding you how much tougher it was last Easter. And just remember, you're doing the right thing. That's what I used to think when I killed some innocent children in Hanoi.
The last sentence was very striking because Haldeman comes across as very cold and mechanical in the rest of the diary, and this is the only thing he says that adds a layer of emotional depth and lucidity and self-awareness to him. Haldeman is also blindly loyal to Nixon during his entire term, but by the time he says this, he may have already developed some resentment towards him because of Watergate. So we have to realize that the diary, although reliable, only gives us a very narrow view into the Nixon administration. It's all the more incomplete that it doesn't cover the entire presidency, as Haldeman is forced to resign, and with it comes the end of his diary on April 30th, 1973.
The end of April 30th. And the end of my official career in the White House, although technically I'll remain on the payroll for a while. I don't know exactly how long. The termination plans haven't been worked out, and we've got to get at that pretty soon too. We'll stay on in some sort of fashion for a while at least to help in the transition, but obviously we're going to have to concentrate on the case from here on out, and the president's going to have to move on to new ways of doing business.
So what did we actually learn from all of this? It's impossible to draw a simple, easy, satisfactory conclusion because there's so many facets to the Nixon administration's perception of drugs and their policymaking. Did they use drugs as a tool to foment controversy and rally support and get votes? Yes. But also they just personally had a negative view of them and their users and saw them as a weapon used by forces outside and inside the country to destroy it. Did they use drug enforcement to arrest political opponents? Yes. Were they racist? Yes. And they were willing to draft up legislation targeting minorities. But was the war on drugs created to repress black people? Well, we can't really answer that from the diaries. But what's more interesting isn't what's in the diaries, it's what's not in them. What did Haldeman not feel necessary to write down? What did he not remember or just not know? Also, Haldeman was not in charge of domestic policy. Ehrlichman was. Also, we know from a quote from March 28, 1973 that diaries from other officials were destroyed. We know for sure that he didn't write everything, because when the Watergate story breaks, Haldeman already talks about the White House connection, but he hadn't written about the plot beforehand. Also, on the day that the infamous smoking gun tape was recorded, Haldeman doesn't mention meeting with Nixon alone. So maybe some things got lost to history and we'll never know exactly. But while we can't confirm the motivations, the impact that the war on drugs had disproportionately affected people of color in the US and destabilized many countries, mainly non-Western, non-majority white countries, especially after it was heavily militarized by subsequent administrations. So there could be a sense of vindication from having Ehrlichman admit that it was designed this way. Reading Haldeman's notes, it's not impossible that Ehrlichman could have said this, especially if he felt resentment for going to prison instead of Nixon. But what the diaries show us is that there was way more to it than one inflammatory soundbite. Also, what's never mentioned in the diaries is whether or not they actually viewed it as a public health emergency. But if their concern was an addiction epidemic, waging an all-out war on drugs was a terrible policy to begin with. One of the main causes for the start of the war on drugs is said to be reports of US soldiers in Vietnam using heroin. One study showed that 34% of soldiers in Vietnam had tried the drug and 20% were addicted to it. However, when they returned home, only 10% had tried the drug again, and the addiction rate fell to 1%. So the environment played a huge factor.
By the way, it seems like the heroin that US soldiers in Vietnam were using was the one produced in order to fight against the communist insurgencies in the region.
When drug abuse was declared a public health emergency, the US experienced 7,000 overdose deaths per year. Waging a war on drugs did absolutely nothing to stop fatal overdoses from exploding to over 100,000 per year, mostly due to the introduction of hyperpotent opioids like fentanyl and now even nitazines in the unregulated black market supply. Nowadays, we understand that addiction is not mainly a pharmacological problem, but a psychological one, usually stemming from trauma, social isolation, and other mental health issues, which should be addressed instead of just focusing on the substances alone. All molecules are just constellations of atoms. What's considered a useful medicine or a dangerous drug is usually dictated by historical, cultural, and legal perceptions of each substance. The war on drugs is a vestige of its time, which is why drugs like cannabis and LSD, which have low to no toxicity, are classed in stricter schedules than, for instance, methamphetamine, which is a prescription medication in some places, including the US. Just in general, waging war on abstract concepts like drugs and terror leads to definitions expanding based on the interpretation of the people waging it, and what ensue are purity spirals that justify more and more means be used to repress the enemy as public liberties are slowly eroded. But all of this is a complex and nuanced discussion, and as interesting as it is, it was not the topic of my documentary. So in the final edit, the Haldeman Diaries only appear for about 20 seconds. And that leads us to a very important point about documentaries in general.
Fact-checking for a documentary is a long and complicated process. Why? Because the truth itself has many layers and they're not always in agreement, as we've just seen. Often, the film script will be overhauled by one key fact that either gets discovered or proven to be false. We can't use the alleged quote from Ehrlichman that brought us to the diaries, but the diaries themselves need to be handled with the proper care of context and subjectivity. We only have one perspective, and only a fraction of it at that. Ideally, if everyone just wrote and published their diaries, it would make historical research slightly easier. It's hard to get the full scope of complex stories and things that happened a long time ago. Piecing together bits of information can make us question whether our own biases color our understanding of them. We only looked at a single source, the diaries, for this video because it makes for a more condensed case study. But to get the full picture, you have to multiply perspectives and confront them to factual sources and context. So while we close the diaries for our research on the war on drugs here, they contain so much more we couldn't explore about the Nixon years, and we encourage you to go read them for yourself, especially if you're interested in topics such as Watergate, US relations with China and the USSR, the Vietnam War, the Middle East, floating the dollar, India-Pakistan, it's all in there, as well as conflicts within the administration and what daily life was like in office. Digging is not only complex, it's also a thrilling part of documentary research and writing. Curiosity and interest is how we keep sources and history in general from collecting dust on the shelves. Richard Nixon resigned in August 1974, almost 50 years ago exactly at the time of recording this video. But so much of what we read in the diaries had a resonance with our current cultural moment. Many of the issues that made headlines back then are still recurrent today, and the same types of rhetoric are being employed with the same results. This means that this whole process is not just relevant to what we do. There is so much information available on the internet, but information is not equal to truth, and our capacity to understand the nuance of what is truth gets reduced by how easy it is to just not dig further and face the contradiction and dissatisfaction of not having neat answers. I'm not saying live your life as if you were researching for a documentary all the time, but it might be more fun than you think.
With the Haldeman Diaries CD-ROM, there is instant access to any information with the click of a button.